Federal Fag and Alex Reynolds Mystery Series Book 2. Author Fred Hunter. Publisher St. Martin's Press, New York, 1998. Narrator Eric Ost. For Raymond Dragon. Chapter 4. "What in the hell are you doing here?" I demanded incredulously. She came in and looked into the bathroom. "He is dead, isn't he? Oh, my goodness. And why are you done up like Mrs. Madrigal?" "Explanations will have to wait until later. We've got to get out of here." With this, she took hold of my arm and started to steer me out of the apartment, but I shook myself free. "Are you out of your mind? That's all we need to be seen fleeing from the scene of a murder." Mother clucked her tongue, folded her arms, and rested her hand on her chin. She certainly looked as if her mind were racing. "Our Lord, I suppose that's true." As entirely befuddled as I was by Mother suddenly turning up in the most supernatural fashion, I have to admit I was so relieved I almost wet myself. There is something remarkably comforting about having your mother on hand when you discover a dead porno star. "I suppose we have to call the police," she said resignedly. "But you know this isn't going to be easy." "I wish you had a boyfriend on the force here," I said with a sardonic laugh. Mother had at one time dated Frank O'Neill, commander of our local area police headquarters in Chicago. They had remained friends, and that kind of relationship comes in handy when you find a corpse. "I can't have one in every port, dear. Now, you wait here, and I'll go call them. There's a phone right here." "I know, but we probably shouldn't touch anything. I'll only be a minute." She started out, but paused in the doorway and turned back to me. "By the by, my name is Gene Robbins, and you don't know me." During our first foray into the spy business, we had not only come across assumed names, but people for whom we had no names at all. I suppose, considering what our lives had become since then, that I shouldn't have been so surprised to find my mother traveling under an alias. But 2,000 miles from where she was supposed to be, after a brief pause, during which I'm sure I looked as dumbfounded as I felt, I replied, "I assume you'll explain that later, too?" "Of course, dear," she said casually as she left. While Mother went off to phone, I scanned the room. It struck me as odd that the place hadn't been tossed. Granted, there wasn't a lot here to throw around, but what little there was seemed to be in perfect order. Perhaps from having seen too many B movies, I expected this kind of murder to be accompanied by a frantic search. The fact that the dead man was a former friend suddenly hit me, and I slumped onto the arm of the couch. "Well, Patrick," I said quietly, "now you'll never know what I wanted to say to you." Then again, I suppose he did know, but that didn't help. I had probably used to tell him how I felt more than he needed to hear it, and now that would never happen. Watching Mother give her statement was really something to behold. She fluttered and chattered as if she were Omaha's answer to Angela Lansbury. She was talking to a detective at a desk that wasn't very far from the one where I waited for the detective who was interviewing me. The room was huge and crammed with industrial desks. Everything glowed unnaturally under the overzealous, harsh fluorescent lights. It was like a nightmare version of the set for Lou Grant. "I live in the building," said Mother. When I heard that, I was awfully glad that my detective had crossed the room to get coffee for the two of us. I could hardly hide my astonishment. "I haven't lived there long. I've only just moved in," she continued, gazing wide-eyed at the detective and making a great show of being stunned by what had happened. "I certainly hope this kind of thing doesn't go on there on a regular basis. As it is, I'll probably have to move, people getting killed and such. I'll not be able to sleep, you see. Not after all this." The detective made a conciliatory grunting noise at her, then said, "Can you tell me what happened?" "I have no idea what happened, but that boy who lived there, he was killed, wasn't he?" "I mean, you were the one who called the police. How did that come about?" Oh, I see. Well, I heard that young man over there come in. She pointed briefly to me, and her voice had taken on a quality meant to convey that she was sure I was pure as the driven snow. You heard him come in? Oh, yes. You can hear every little noise in that courtyard. Every single noise. And everyone who comes into the courtyard is announced, so to speak, by the noise from the front door. It squeaks, just like a knife going through your brain. I really don't see why the landlord can't do something about it. I'll certainly have to have a word with him. She stopped, and the detective stared at her blankly for a moment before saying, Ma'am? Oh, cried Mother, looking properly embarrassed. Oh, yes, so I heard him come in and walk around, and I looked out my window just to see who it was, because you can never be too careful. And I saw him walk to the dead boy's door and knock, and then he called to me, and then he tried the door. Mother's face took on a decidedly cunning look. And then I told myself that I'd better keep watching because I'd never seen him before, and you can never be too sure if someone's just being artful about breaking in. Yes, ma'am. Anyway, he tried the door and it opened, and he had just stepped in when I suddenly heard him scream. When she said that last, she looked over at me, and I got the impression that she was trying to make sure I'd heard that. I blinked. So I ran downstairs to see whatever was the matter, continued Mother. And there was that poor young man dead in the bath, and that nice young boy over there looking white as a sheet as if he just walked in and found a dead body, which he had. I see. The detective didn't seem noticeably moved by anything Mother said, but I did get the impression that he believed her, which is not surprising. Upper-class British accents are just so eminently believable. It was also clear that he didn't make any connection between Mother and me, which I'm sure was mainly because, though Mother was scrupulously maintaining her accent despite decades of living in America, I was born and raised here, and my own voice has a brashness that seems to revolt against hers. So, said the detective, taking a deep breath, you can hear everything, but you didn't hear a shot. No, I didn't, said Mother with a disappointed shake of her head. So you see, it must have happened last night while I was asleep. About what time would that be? What? Said Mother, wrinkling her forehead. Do you remember when you went to sleep and when you got up? Mother sat back in her chair, looked at him as if she'd just discovered he had 3 arms. Well, of course I do. I'm not daft, I went to bed about 11 and got up about 6. It was at this point that Detective Rob Furness, he pronounced it furnace, when he introduced himself, arrived back at the desk with 2 styrofoam cups of coffee, one of which he handed to me. Thank you, I said meekly. Furness appeared to be about 40. He was wearing a suit that looked too expensive for him and a tie with red and blue stripes that must have been a Father's Day gift. His eyes were brown and his hair was almost black, with a layer of gray that seemed to hang on the tips like frost. He reiterated everything he'd said to me at Patrick's apartment, but they wanted me to come in with them simply so they could get a statement, not because they thought I was involved in any way. His explanation had been reassuring, but his manner had convinced me that if I resisted, I'd be thrown to the ground, cuffed, and dragged in, but that could just have been my imagination. Meeting the police at the scene of a murder has a tendency to make one feel extremely culpable. It didn't help that I'd been frisked at the scene, which the detective assured me was just a precaution. Now he asked me how I knew the deceased, another question that he'd asked me at the scene. And I explained again that we'd gone to college together and that I hadn't seen Patrick for almost 10 years, but since I was out here with a friend on a visit, I thought I'd look Patrick up. With a friend? I sighed. Detective, I make no secret of being gay. Yes, with a friend. With my husband, in fact. Furness let out a non-committal then said, This Patrick Gleason, was he gay? Yes. So after 10 years, you showed up on your friend's doorstep and found him dead. Actually, I saw him for the first time yesterday. We had lunch at a place called Bixby's. I see. He made a note on his pad. He was silent for a couple of minutes, staring at his notes. How was he yesterday? I had the distinct feeling that Furness was trying to catch me up in something, but it's possible that it was just that, being a detective, he naturally looked like he suspected everybody. I said, What do you mean? Happy, sad, depressed, nervous. Had he changed? I thought for a moment and said, well, he hadn't really changed much from when I knew him. Knew him? I didn't like the way he said this. He made it sound as if all existing homosexuals would get around to having sex with each other given enough time. He also gave me the impression he was determined to make some kind of connection between me coming to L.A. and Patrick's death. Even though I knew that there couldn't conceivably be any connection, Furness's attitude was unnerving. But frankly, I could understand it if he was suspicious. Showing up just before Patrick was killed proved that I hadn't lost my impeccably bad timing. So he didn't give any sort of indication at this lunch of yours that anything was wrong, that he was in any danger. Not at all. Just the opposite. He acted like he didn't have a care in the world. Furness looked me directly in the eyes for a moment, which I thought was another ploy to make me uncomfortable. So I just held his gaze, which probably made me look more guilty. God, this whole thing was making me paranoid, and that's saying a lot coming from someone who's been working for the government. At last he said, "Do you know any reason somebody want to kill him?" "No, but yeah. I don't know how much you know about him." Furness sat back in his chair and clasped his hands behind his neck. "Tell me." "Well, Patrick did porno movies. Gay porn." Although he took the news without emotion, I had the distinct impression that it had taken an effort for him not to raise his eyebrows. "So I don't know if that could have anything to do with it." "Could be," he replied very casually. He asked me endless questions about finding the body. In fact, he asked me the same endless questions several times over, until my brain was beginning to feel like tapioca. Just when I thought I was approaching the end of my endurance, the other detective came over and showed Furness a sheet of paper that I took to be my mother's statement. Furness read it over, and when he finished, nodded to the detective. We went back to Mother. "We'll have somebody drive you home, ma'am," he said. Mother rose from her chair and glanced anxiously in my direction. She cocked her head to the side, which I took to mean that she wanted me to follow her as soon as I was able. I couldn't, by word or expression, acknowledge her, for fear of the detective taking notice, so she left without knowing whether or not I'd caught on. "Detective Furness," I said, giving my full attention back to my interrogator, "do you really have any reason to believe I have anything to do with Patrick's death?" His eyes narrowed, and he stared at me for at least 30 seconds, then he said, "As a matter of fact, no." "You don't?" He smiled for the first time since I'd met him. "You sound surprised." "It's just all these questions." His voice took on a tone that implied that my little inconvenience couldn't be helped. "Well, you didn't have a gun on you when we arrived, and according to that lady, you didn't have time to shoot this guy and then hide the gun. That kind of evidence means a lot coming from a stranger." I felt my throat constrict. "And I'll tell you the truth, the way he was killed, especially giving the porn angle, the way he was killed looks like a hit." "A hit?" I said, unable to hide my incredulity. "You mean like the mob?" "Yes, Mr. Reynolds," he said, producing an unpleasant smirk that mimicked detectives from gangster movies of the 40s. "The mob, organized crime." I tried to hold my temper, but he really was trying it. "It's just that that's the type of thing you hear about, but you don't really believe it exists." "What makes you think it was a hit?" He pointed to his forehead and his chest in turn, indicating where Patrick had been shot. "Head and heart. It's like a signature." There was something curiously resigned in the way he'd uttered this brief reply that made me uneasy. "You do think you can find out who did this, don't you?" "We'll make every effort," he replied dully, sounding exactly as if that's all the effort he was prepared to make. "You don't sound too hopeful. We have a lot of murders here, and the hardest ones to solve and the lowest priority are the disposables." "Disposables?" I said, barely able to hide my contempt. "You mean like faggots?" He glared at me. "That could hardly be the case here. I'm sure you know that some of the most important people in this town are gay." I knew that the hesitation before saying this was because at the last minute he thought the better of using the same word I'd used. He continued, "I meant pushers, users, hustlers, prostitutes, generally the type of people that the public is glad are gone." I stared at him blankly because what he'd said caused me to examine myself for a moment. a reaction that I'm pretty sure Furness had been trying for. He was right. Those were exactly the type of people for whom I'd never spread any sympathy when I read or heard of them being murdered. I'd go so far as to say I thought they were better off. At last I said, "But Patrick was none of those things." "Long time since you've seen him. A lot could have changed, and one thing you should know is a lot of those guys in gay porn are hustlers." He stopped and smirked again. "Excuse me. They call themselves escorts. It's how they make most of their money. Porn is just like advertising." "But he was so clean," I said, sounded like a 50s housewife in an Ajax commercial. Furness shook his head and smiled. "What do you think hustlers are covered with soot? A street punk with scabs isn't going to get a lot of work." I sat there dumbly for a moment. I'd thought the emotional acrobatics I'd experienced since finding Patrick on that tape had subsided after our inauspicious lunch, but on talking to this detective, they started all over again. I had, after all, once felt something for this man who'd been murdered. However misguided and adolescent those feelings might have been, and I couldn't accept that he'd become something so foreign to me. Betrayal is one thing, total alienation is another. Furness broke in on my reverie, but by saying, "But I meant what I told you. We'll make every effort to find the killer. I just can't hold out a lot of hope to you, though." "Sure." My tone was unfortunate. I really didn't believe they'd do anything about Patrick's murder, and if what Furness said was true, I really didn't believe there was anything they could do about it. But I knew he'd meant well by saying it. "One thing before you go, though, we'd like to take your fingerprints." "Mine? Why?" "Just to help in our investigation, to be able to separate yours, since we know you were there, from anybody else's." He said this in a way that made me wonder if he was simply trying to give me grief for casting aspersions on the police, and at the same time leave me a little off balance. "And I'd prefer that you didn't leave town for the time being." I decided to adopt the same attitude. My eyes narrowed, and I said, "Oh, I have no intention of leaving." Gay Mysteries audiobooks. I think it is easy to hate a label, but a face humanizes the word. So this effort is twofold: to offer comfort to those like myself that your world didn't end because you don't fit into the view of acceptable society on both sides, and in hopes of helping those with family that are LGBTQ, that it doesn't mean we are aliens from the child they once knew. Reassure them so they can maybe be supportive at the same time, being true to their values.